Hi students, it's been a while, but welcome back to another video e-lesson, this one over Frederick Douglass and abolitionism. As always with these videos, please feel free to pause and rewind at any time to take notes, rewatch, or catch up. Let's see what we're going to talk about today. First of all, we're going to talk about Frederick Douglass. It's italicized, so I mean the book, Frederick Douglass, as in his narrative. We're also going to talk about Frederick Douglass, the man, and then a little bit about the abolitionism movement, which as we continue our unit on abolitionist literature, we'll get more and more into what went on with the abolitionism movement. Let's talk about Frederick Douglass. First of all, the book. Frederick Douglass as a narrative of the life of Frederick Douglass, the key facts. Its full title was Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, written by himself. That's a mouthful. In this class, we're just going to call it Frederick Douglass. It was written, of course, by Frederick Douglass himself, as the title actually says, and it was published in 1845. It is set on the eastern shore of Maryland, also in Baltimore, also a little bit in New York City toward the end, and finally the book ends with Douglass in New Bedford, Massachusetts. And it's set between the years of 1818 roundabout. You remember, he's not quite sure when he was born. That's kind of where his story starts. And it's all the way through the year 1841. The point of view, it's told from the first person point of view because it's a narrative. It even says narrative. It's first person narrative. And it is narrated by Douglass himself. The genre, this is a piece of nonfiction. This is an autobiography, and this is a part of that select group of works to come out of the 19th century, something unique to America. It's the slave narrative. There's a whole group of these written by former slaves that just detail their lives as slaves and their struggles. Frederick Douglass the man, he was born Frederick Bailey in Talbot County, Maryland, around 1818, 1817. Remember how he starts the book. He's not quite sure when he was born. That's something that slave masters would keep from their slaves in order to further kind of dehumanize them. He died in Washington, D.C. in 1895 of a heart attack. His enslavement, he was enslaved his life up until the age of 20. All in eastern Maryland. You remember throughout the book, throughout his narrative, he constantly worried about being sold downriver to the much harsher working conditions on the bigger plantations in Alabama and Georgia. But he was fortunate, I should say relatively fortunate, to have been a slave entirely in eastern Maryland. The northernmost slave states were, while not easy for slaves, were a little bit slightly better conditions for slave workers. Continuing, Frederick Douglass's escape from slavery. He escaped in 1838. This is in the book. His exact details for escaping aren't in the book, but when he actually escaped, that's 1838, he was aided by a woman named Anna Murray. More on her in just a minute. She's not really mentioned much in the book, and there's a good reason for that. To escape, Frederick Douglass disguised himself as a sailor, which was not an uncommon profession for black men in the North. Borrowed the identification papers of a free black sailor, who that other sailor went to some put himself in great danger to do so. He could have gotten in a lot of trouble and been put in prison for letting an escaped slave use his identification papers. Frederick Douglass, with these identification papers, he boarded a train to Philadelphia, and from there spent the little money he had to travel to New York, which is kind of where he picks up in the last chapter of his narrative. Anna Murray is not mentioned much in the book, and there's a very good reason for that. It's because Anna Murray, Frederick Douglass was in love with Anna Murray and eventually married her, and Frederick Douglass goes to great pains not to incriminate or endanger anyone in his narrative, which, since his book came out in the 1840s, and slavery was still a thing, he could have gotten some people in trouble, especially those people who helped him, the people he loved. So he doesn't mention much of her until the very end of the book, when he's already escaped to relative safety. Anna Murray was a free black woman from Baltimore. She worked as a launderer and housekeeper, and Douglass met her while he was working in the shipyards, if you recall that, toward, I think, chapter 9, something like that, when he was working in the shipyards as a caulker, helping build ships. Anna Murray, as we remember from the final chapter of the book, eventually married Frederick Douglass after he escaped to New York. He sent for her, and she joined him in New York, and they eventually settled in New Bedford, Massachusetts. Frederick Douglass, after his his enslavement, he eventually became a lecturer, a journalist, an author, and a statesman. Did a lot of things with his life. Spoke primarily, as you can imagine, for the abolition of slavery throughout the United States, but also he was a women's rights advocate, and he was even an Irish independence advocate. He spoke on the circuit in Ireland and Great Britain for Irish independence. And yeah, he toured extensively. He was again a lecturer, so he toured extensively. His writings, Frederick Douglass wrote eventually 3 autobiographies. Each one sort of expanded on the previous one. He published some abolitionist newspapers, the North Star being his most famous. He even published a letter to his former master. It was published in his North Star newspaper, and in this letter, he kind of publicly berates his master for the evil practices that he that his former master would enact on his slaves. And Douglass even inquires in this very public letter. He inquires after the rest of his family, like what happened to the rest of his family after he escaped. Douglass didn't achieve his obtain his legal freedom. There we go. That's the verb I'm looking for. Did not obtain his legal freedom until 1846, which is before the book ends. Or if you recall from the book, when the book ends, he is still very much a fugitive slave. He is not technically free. He's freer, but there's always the threat of him being sent back to the South. He didn't actually obtain legal freedom until 1846, and he only was able to do this through British supporters. Through some of his lecture touring in Great Britain, some of his supporters that saw him speak, they were so touched by his story that they actually got together, raised funds to buy his freedom from Thomas Auld, and only then did Frederick Douglass have the papers that said he was actually a free man in the United States. The abolitionism movement, you probably know this from your U.S. history classes. What was it? It was the political, social, and religious movements that sought to end the African slave trade and set slaves free. Abolitionism movements were all over the European world and the Western world as well. Meaning the Western Hemisphere as well. Anywhere that there was slavery, there was an active abolitionism movement before it was finally ended. Just to give you some global context about abolition of slavery in Europe, Great Britain abolished slavery throughout its entire empire in 1833. And so you can kind of see that it took America another 30 plus years to get on that boat, board, train, whatever. France abolished slavery even earlier than this, technically, back in the 18th century. But it had to abolish slavery once again, but it did so back in 1848. It had been reestablished by Napoleon in 1802. But again, France had abolished slavery way back in the 18th century, and there hadn't been really very few slaves actually in Britain or France. This was mostly slavery in its colonies. The abolition of slavery in America took a little bit longer. The importation of slaves was ceased in 1808, so no new slaves were being brought over from Western Africa. Most northern states had outlawed slavery by 1808. Southern society, though, was slave-based. As we all know, the economy was dependent on slave labor. And then finally, of course, slavery was officially abolished following the Civil War and the 13th Amendment in 1865. Some notable abolitionists. Here are some names you need to know as far as who ran in the abolitionist circles, who were the most prominent abolitionists. First of all, Emerson and Thoreau, our transcendentalist figureheads. Towards the end of their careers as transcendentalists, they were still transcendentalists, but by the 1840s and 1850s, they kind of saw a new mission in life. They weren't trying to so much reform our spirits and our spirituality. They were trying to literally reform the employment of slavery in the South. So they became pretty notable abolitionists. Another one, William Wilberforce, was a British statesman who was instrumental in Britain abolishing slavery in the 1830s. William Lloyd Garrison, perhaps the most famous abolitionist in America. He was an American lecturer and newspaper publisher, the most outspoken abolitionist of American abolitionism. Wendell Phillips was an American lecturer and writer, also a lawyer. I believe he does one of the introductions or forewords to most versions of Frederick Douglass's narrative. John Brown, a famous name. He was an American anti-slavery militant who led the failed slave revolt at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. So he was an abolitionist, but he took it a step further. He actually was a militant who led an armed revolt, a failed revolt at Harper's Ferry. And then finally, Harriet Beecher Stowe. Not finally, there's one more after this. Harriet Beecher Stowe, best known for her work, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was one of the first novels to really shed light on the truth of slavery in the American South. And then finally, here we go, David Walker, who was an African-American anti-slavery advocate. He was probably the most fiery of the African-American anti-slavery advocates. His speeches were really, really heated. Look, quick note about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. First of all, their Fugitive Slave Acts have been around since there were fugitive slaves to deal with. But by 1850, the Fugitive Slave Acts had lost a lot of their power. And so as a concession made by the federal government to keep the South from seceding, the United States passed the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850. And what this did is it required northern states to assist in returning escaped slaves to the South. And you can imagine northern states did not want to do this because they were against slavery. They did not. It was not vital to their economy, and so they were taking the moral high ground. And here, now the federal government steps in and says, no, you guys, even if you don't believe in slavery, you have to help the South with something that you don't believe in. Caused a lot of controversy, but again, it was a last-ditch effort to keep the South from seceding, and it worked for 10 years. In the Fugitive Slave Act, it required that states use their available means, their militias, their law enforcement, to help return slaves. Law enforcement officers in northern states were actually bound by law to arrest anyone they suspected of being a slave. You can imagine kind of some gray area there. It was very difficult to just look at someone or overhear someone and suspect them of being a slave. So very difficult law to enforce. Very difficult law to ethically enforce as well. And of course, if you were suspected of being an escaped slave, it was very, very difficult for you to prove that you weren't. You had to actually have your sort of citizenship papers. You weren't really technically a citizen, but your freedom, your papers that said you were a free man. Otherwise, you could be wrongfully sent to the South, to be a slave in the South where you hadn't come from originally. So it's very, very controversial laws. Before you finish up this e-lesson, I have one more video I want you to watch. It's the next one right beneath this link on the Learning Hub. It's another one of those great crash course videos done by John Green, and it's over slavery. Thank you for watching, students. This has been a video about Frederick Douglass and abolitionism. Please feel free to watch again, go back, take notes, do what you need to do, and I'll see you in class.